And the poem is called Two Kinds of Intelligence. I think it sets the grounding for not knowing. There are two kinds of intelligence. One acquired as a child in school, memorizes facts and concepts from books and from what the teacher says, collecting information from the traditional sciences, as well as the new sciences. With such intelligence, you rise in the world, you get ranked ahead or behind others in regarding your competence in retaining information. You stroll with this intelligence in and out of fields of knowledge, getting always more marks on your preserving tablets. There is another kind of tablet, one already completed and preserved inside you, a spring overflowing its springboks, a freshness in the center of the chest. This other intelligence does not turn yellow or stagnate. It's fluid and it doesn't move from outside to inside through conduits of plumbing learning. The second knowledge is a fountainhead from within you, moving out. So I'm going to share my screen and hopefully you'll be able to see, and we can begin the presentation. So what I'd like to talk to you today in this short session is about not knowing, and how, when we're facing the unknown, how might we be able to coach from the space of unknowing, assisting our clients, but also operating and living our lives from this space. So I think that's the main idea in this short talk. As I'm sharing with you these ideas, I want you to know from the beginning, I'm not an expert, and really I'm viewing this as a collective space where we can provide our own collective wisdom and support to each other. So I do ask you, as you have insights or you have knowledge from your experience as coaches, as therapists, as practitioners, as human beings, to enter into the chat your thoughts, your knowledge and your ideas as we progress, and we can all benefit from that. Now, this isn't about fixing, but more about exploring. So I'm not going to be offering solutions. There's going to be no practical tips, but I'm hopefully offering ideas that you might wrestle with, and questions that you can live with after the talk, and that will lead to new opportunities for you and also for your clients. And although I have a plan, I'm going to hold it loosely. So I'm curious to see how you respond to what comes up in the chat, and to see what wants to emerge now in this session with you all. So I guess it's the difference between a presentation and almost like a sharing and an exchange. And I hope that this experience is more of the latter. So I'll give some input, but please do participate actively. Do enter into the chat your thoughts as we go, so that we can make it into that dialogue. So I'd like to ask, by asking you to enter into the chat, just your first thoughts on this topic. What's been your relationship to the unknown over the past several months during COVID? And what patterns have you noticed in your relationship to the unknown? So we have been faced with a very visceral experience, not knowing one day to the other about our own, perhaps our own livelihoods, our health, the health of loved ones, the situation, the macro perspective, but also the internal. So how have you dealt with that personally? And what have you noticed about your relationship to the unknown? So just give you a few seconds. If you could enter into the chat, I'm curious to see what your own reflections are. So think back over the several months, maybe the past two, and what would you say are some of your reactions? I invite you to enter into the chat.
Grasping for security, very strong bond, increased with health issues, changing relationships with children, resignation, tumultuous. Gosh, it's going so fast now.
Okay.
Some kind of joy, anxiety, was a bit anxiety. First uncertainty, but getting trust during it, appreciation and enduring long.
Thank you.
Sometimes a lot of fear. Manic and options for change coming up. Stress. Any more? Depends on the aspect of life in question. In one area of relationships difficulty, I've used writing as a place to work for the emotions, and it's been really fertile. Curious, one person.
Thank you for sharing that. And there's a lot. Thank you, Joe, and thank you all for entering into the chat. There's a lot of emotions, and a lot of them were also quite heavy and painful, as well as the positive. There's polarity with the curiosity and perhaps excitement at seeing what emerges. But for many of us, the experience of the unknown isn't necessarily pleasant, and it can be psychologically and physically painful to experience. And so this is what we're going to be looking at more in this course of the hour. And I hope that by the end of the hour, that our relationship to the unknown, you have a different perspective on that and a new perspective. So I'd like to start by, thinking about our own relationship to knowledge as coaches, as therapists, as educators. And often we rely on our knowledge. We've done a lot of education, a lot of training, perhaps, and professional qualifications. And yet we're faced in situations that are complex and that we don't have the answers. I like to give the analogy of a chess grandmaster. As of a few years ago, there were 1,441 chess grandmasters. And these are people with really high cognitive abilities. But in general, they can only think about 15 moves ahead. And imagine that, only 15 moves. That's a game with fixed and predictable rules. But we're operating in life where there's millions of actors and actresses acting predictably and unpredictably, rationally and irrationally. It's impossible that anybody has all the answers. If you've read Daniel Kahneman, it's impossible that anybody has all the answers. If you've read Daniel Kahneman, he wrote a really good book called Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow. And the conclusion he talked about unconscious biases. He says, if you think you have reasons for your beliefs, you're probably mistaken. So the idea is that we don't know as much as we think. And the situations that we're facing now in our own lives and our clients are facing are not just simple, where we can go to Google to find the answer. That's for simple issues, but they're not also complicated. So an example of a complicated problem might be you can take apart a Ferrari and you can put it back together. It's extremely complicated, but it's knowable. But the challenges we're facing are more complex and even chaotic. So the metaphor you might think of is the rainforest, where there's so many variables that make up a system. By tinkering one element of the system, we don't know what impact it will have on another element. So the fact is, the situation we're facing now are more complex than simple or complicated. And it's impossible that we know what to do. Yet the things that we most fear, often given our expertise, and can be to say, I don't know, and to face the fact that the vulnerability of not knowing and all that entails. What I'd like to do is reframe not knowing, and often we use the analogy of being in the dark. We say somebody who doesn't know is in the dark, and we think of it as negative. But I'd like to frame it as positive, because by embracing not knowing, it allows us to avoid hubris, overconfidence, and it can allow us to take responsibility. So two psychologists won the Nobel Prize in Cornell. They said confidence isn't the problem, it's overconfidence. And even looking at issues like the financial crisis, it wasn't that they didn't know what was happening. There were many reports, for example, in the financial stability reports. And Greenspan, he wrote in his autobiography, he said he's never seen a greater example of wishful thinking combined with hubris. So it's how do we develop and cultivate our relationship with not knowing and be more comfortable. And I like the metaphor of light and dark. It shows it's equal, and yet we tend to privilege the light. We tend to privilege what's seen. Yet most growth, most change, transformation happens in the darkness, happens in the seed in the earth, the baby in the womb. Just when we think nothing is happening, and maybe we're worried that things aren't going according, that's the place and the period where gestation's happening, where transformation is taking place. So I invite you to think about the darkness, if you're experiencing that now with the unknown, as the space of transformation. Now, when we're faced with the unknown, and many of you were sharing emotions over the last several months, It's not pleasant, and it can feel extremely painful. And in the book we wrote called Not Knowing, we use the metaphor of Finisterre. And some of you will be familiar. There's an ancient pilgrimage. It's called the Camino de Santiago. It goes from France to Spain. There are many routes. But if you walk 90 kilometers further from Santiago, you reach the coastal town of Finisterre. And in Latin, Finisterre meant the end of the earth. And literally, they thought sailors would go there and they wouldn't return. So in the maps, they used to draw lions and serpents and dragons because it was that terrifying. And when we are at the edge and we don't know what to do, it can feel extremely terrifying and extremely unstable. And we can feel this in a very embodied way. So we might notice that we have a pain in an ache in our stomach. You can notice maybe clammy hands, maybe our body's more tense. But there's a visceral feeling that when we're at the edge, this is what we experience. Now, there's certain reactions that happen when we're at the edge. And these are almost like clues, somatic clues, but also the clues in terms of our behavior. What do we do when we're at the edge? So these are some of the common ones. And as I share them, I'd like you to think about which one do you relate to most? And have you observed any of these patterns in your own reaction at the edge? So the first pattern at the edge, and you can see in the top corner, I call control. This is when we do anything to try to retain control of a situation. So we might, for example, put more rules and regulations trying to control. We might micromanage. We might find other ways to rein in and maybe reduce the uncertainty that we're feeling. So give you an example, I was buying a house in London, and the vendor who I was purchasing from wasn't completing by a certain date. And if she didn't sign a paper, I wouldn't have a place to live. So I felt very uncertain. So I said to my estate agent, if she's not able to complete by this date, I have to withdraw from the purchase. And my estate agent said to me, Stephen, can you remain just a little longer in the unknowing? And I never received or never expected to receive sage advice from an estate agent, but they were right. So I remained with my own feelings of uncomfortableness. And we did complete. It was very successful. But the attempt to say, I'm going to withdraw from the purchase was my way of regaining control. The second picture at the top shows passivity, resignation. So you might feel it doesn't matter, nothing ever works here, things won't change, different ways that we can feel resigned in the face of the unknown. The third picture at the top, I call paralysis by analysis. This is, for example, we do a spreadsheet. We try to think through all the logical reasons. If we're in a company, we hire consultants like McKinsey. They come in and do all their analysis, their interviews, but by the time they've done that and all their analysis, the situation has changed. The picture on the bottom corner, of Homer, I call catastrophic thinking. This is when our mind automatically goes to the worst. Nothing will change. I'll lose my job. I'll never recover. I'll catch this. Things will never be the same again. We think the worst case scenario and our mind goes there and it spends its time, occupies it there. So that's a common reaction at the edge. The next picture with the person with the paper, I call the 30-second rush to action. It's do anything, do it quickly. And it's almost like we can't sit in any moment with the uncomfortableness. We have to move, we have to do something rather than staying with what we're feeling. The next picture with the boulder, I call resistance. That may show up in procrastination, it may show up in other ways that we resist experiencing the unknown. Maybe it can come out in addictions, other ways that we find to avoid or to resist, to not look at, to not be in relationship with the unknown. And the last picture, something common, and maybe you've read a lot around this issue, I call spiritual bypassing. And this is when we might avoid feeling our emotions and finding the sensitivity there, and maybe go to concept, go to ideas, rather than with the feeling and with the body and engaging in our emotions. So what I'd like you to do is to look at these images, and you may have your own one that isn't here, and that's perfectly fine. That's your experience. And the question I'd like to ask is, what is your default reaction when you face the unknown? Obviously, there are many reactions we have. We might have multiple. But if you were to notice and you were to look back at yourself over the last several months or what you know of yourself, what would you say is your default reaction? I'd like you to enter it into the chat. And then I'd like you to think about, how does this serve you and how does it hinder you? And so what I'm trying to do is not pathologize any of these reactions. So to talk, for example, the catastrophic thinking, it serves us because we're prepared for the worst to happen. So if I'm always thinking I'll lose my job, maybe I'm training for a new job, maybe I'm finding some way to be ready in case that happens. But so that's how it serves me. You know, there's a good book called Only the Paranoid Survive. But how it costs me is that it takes a huge emotional, mental toll and worrying for something that may never happen. So I'm living in that fear. I think it's Mark Twain that said, you know, most of our worries are things that never happened. So I'd like you just to reflect for yourself, because it's this conscious awareness of our own patterns at the edge, which gives us more choice. And once we're aware of that, in order to do something different. So please enter into the chat, and I'll ask Joe if you could read out some of the default reactions at the edge, how it helps people, but also how it costs.
Okay, overwhelm and give up, feel inadequate, get hyper-focused and affect and then collapse over the crisis. Control hinders by materialize imperfection, always busy. Faced with the unknown, slow down. Distraction, find something to do, resist making any decisions. The unknowing, biggest reason I'm stuck in self-destruction patterns. Sometimes fixed, sometimes going in hyperactivity. Spiritual bypass, add in different ones. So handling it up, mantras and sutras. Sat is powerful.
Now, how does it serve you, but how does it hinder you? So if you're reflecting on your experiences at the edge, how is that hindering you and how is it serving you? So please do enter into the chat. I'm curious as to how it does both.
We got resistance and serve by making feel safe. We've just had full catastrophe. Hinder because I'm scared to move forward. We're not getting any. We're getting any of the positives.
How does it serve you? Yes, that's a good point, Joe. So how does your behavior serve you? Imagine it accomplishes a function and it's not just negative. How might that be serving you?
Closing off from others keeps my environment safe. High functioning gets me through the crisis, but depletes me in the long run. Protects me from taking action versus inhibits me in life. Gives comfort and safety, but then separates from others. Keeps me focused on my situation. Positive because it can get my inside. Little breath brings me back to life. Any more? I'm coming in.
Yeah, I think that's a very rich examples, and thank you, Joe, for reading them, and thank you everybody for sharing them. And this is something I'm hoping that you become more conscious of over the coming weeks. When I'm dealing with individuals, you know, for example, we don't normally reflect what is our pattern at the edge and notice what's happening in our body when we feel this. Normally our actions are automatic and they're default. And it's not only individuals that have reactions, organizations have them as well. So when I work in companies, for example, some companies are very much paralysis by analysis, while other cultures are very much rush to action. So we often have deeper discussions about what is it that they can do and how does it serve them by taking action quickly, but what does it cost in terms of quick fixes or maybe taking action on the wrong things without addressing the underlying problems. So it's something I hope that you take away and you remember after this talk. But the value in the edge is that it also takes us to the opportunity, it takes us to the liminality, or it takes us to the space where something is possible is new in our lives. That wasn't possible when we were in the center. And that's the beauty of Finisterre. That's the beauty of arriving. There's a poem by the poet David White. Many of you will be familiar with his work. And I'd like to read this poem. It's called Finisterre. And as I read it, I want you to imagine it's talking to you about your arrival at the edge. Finisterre. The road in the end, taking the path the sun had taken into the western sea and the moon rising behind you as you stood where ground turned to ocean. No way to your future now, but the way your shadow could take, walking before you across water, going where shadows go. No way to make sense of a world that wouldn't let you pass, except to call an end to the way you had come, to take out each frayed letter you had brought and light their illumined corners, and to read them as they drifted on the late western light, to empty your bags, to sort this and to leave that, to promise what you needed to promise all along, and to abandon the shoes that brought you here, right at the water's edge, not because you had given up, but because now you would find a different way to tread, and because through it all, part of you would still walk on, no matter how, over the waves. So it's a beautiful poem about how we leave behind, but also that we move on past Finisterre. I want to mention here that I'm not suggesting that we all must be able to tolerate this anxiety and this pain at the edge. I love this little meme that integration training Mark created. And it's really useful to have a way to self-regulate and a way to calm ourselves and a way to ground ourselves, particularly at the edge. And I don't really call it self-regulation because I think it's also co-regulation. We need each other, and we need to find a way to connect to resource ourselves. And that may not just be an individual activity. So I'd like you to reflect when you're at the edge. How do you regulate? How do you resource yourself? What are some of the most effective methods that you've used with clients? For example, centering is a common one in embodiment. And one that I've used and I found particularly helpful for me is when I'm at the edge, is the work of Byron Katie, which he says all thoughts belong on paper. When they're in the mind, they're hard to navigate, hard to really examine. And I've used her work, her 4 questions to ask, particularly my catastrophic thoughts. Is it true? How do I know that it's true? How do I behave when I believe that thought? And who would I be if I couldn't think or didn't have the thought? And then I turn it around. But what are some of the methods that you've tried and you use effectively to resource, to regulate yourself at the edge? So I invite you to enter that into the chat now. And Joe, if you could read out a few of those thoughts, that would be appreciated.
Right. Hiking, breath awareness. Keep bringing them in. Close my eyes, feeling the edges together, playing with the sensations in toes, exploring together. Resourcing self, cold water swimming. Success to clients journal on their thoughts. Art therapy, gratitude, yoga, moving, stay in connection with spiritual teacher, embodiment routine, forest bathing, effective walking, cup of tea, dancing, music, walk in nature, come back to the senses, hypnosis downloads, contemplation of nature and dancing, listening and music and moving to music, playing with the dog, sports and nature, looking at the sky.
Thank you, Joe. There's many more answers, I'm sure, and thank you for sharing. And there's some rich, probably some things that you haven't tried there that you've heard other people input. So I encourage you to maybe explore some of them to see what works for you and what can give you that regulation and what can be helpful for clients, often to propose and to see where they feel their energy goes and to experiment with those. Now, one of the main, when I started to write the book, Not Knowing with Deanna, was often we heard that it was all about uncertainty. You know, it's how do you help people live with uncertainty? And you can go to any bookshop, you can see many books on mastering uncertainty. And at the time, I wanted to write a new book. I'd done two before. And the problem was I didn't know what to write about. And then it struck me, it's not that I feel uncertain, it's that I don't know. And not knowing isn't the same as uncertainty. So, for example, at Christmas or Eid or another festival, we don't, children, when their presents are wrapped, they don't feel uncertain about what's in their present, but they feel curious, they feel excited, they feel full of wonder. So uncertainty is only one feeling in response to the unknown, where there's a myriad of different feelings that can be available to us in response to the unknown. So I became curious along with Diana, who is it that relates to the unknown, not as a place of uncertainty, but as a space of opportunity. So we began to interview a range of people, from artists, from adventurers, to explorers, to entrepreneurs, to scientists, all of them who viewed the unknown from a very, very different space. And what we discovered was that they didn't add more skills to their tool sets, as it were, figuratively, but rather it was a question of unlearning. So what we proposed and what we discovered was 4 negative capabilities, or 4 ways to think about the unknown that were different and didn't mean adding something to how you were thinking. The word negative capability, if you haven't heard that phrase before, it comes from the poet Keats. He wrote a letter to his brothers, George and Thomas, and he defined a negative capability as the ability to be with mystery, uncertainty, and doubt, without irritable reaching after fact and reason. So it's talking about how do you stay longer with the mystery, how do you embrace it. So let me quickly share what were the 4 negative capabilities and see how might you explore these in your coaching relationship with your coachees, but also embody them for yourself as a coach. So the first one comes, and it's a common one. You'll know this from the work of Zen, but it's empty your cup. It's this idea of having this beginner's mind. And the example that came to me is when I was training as a therapist in Gestalt. I had a supervision, and I was working with a young client who had several years of depression. And being a newbie, I thought I needed to know all about depression in order to be of help. And my supervisor was saying to me, Stephen, what makes you think you need to become an expert in order to be of service here, at least in factual knowledge? What is it that will make a difference to this client? And it may be that the relationship is more important than what you know. And he told me a quote, and you'll be familiar with this, but it's Suzuki Sen Roshi. And the quote is this: in the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the expert's mind, there are few. So it's how do we embody this beginner's mind? And it's not pretending that we don't know, but it's making the space for curiosity. It's making space for this freshness and aliveness rather than resting in what we know. I remember I was speaking to one of my colleagues. She was head of a large Italian bank. They were looking for a consultant to help with a merger and acquisition. And there was a very confident consultant came in, said, I've seen this 99 times before. I know exactly what to do. And she said, I'm never going to hire you, because if you think that the next time is the same as the previous times, then you're not the person we need. How can you be so arrogant? So there's this sense, how can we be fresh? When I did my coach training, it was with Newfield, and my trainer at the time told us a story about the founder of Aikido, who reportedly asked to be buried in a white belt. So even though he was a master at his profession and a technical expert, he still wanted to convey he was a beginner and he could see things with a fresh attitude. And we can see examples of where beginner's mind has led to the fast growth of things. for example, microfinance or telephone banking, they all accelerated, for example, in Africa or India, where there were no pre-existing pathways, and they didn't have to go through a leap of sequential incremental leap, but they could go to something new. The founder of the Grameen Bank, Mohammed Yunus, who won the Nobel Prize, he said, not knowing something can be a blessing sometimes because you're open and you can do things in your way without worrying about rules and procedures. When he wanted to know what to do, he looked at what the conventional banks did. They went to the rich, he went to the poor, they went to the men, he went to the women. He says, I could try because I didn't know anything. One way that we can embody this as coaches is encouraging our clients to stay longer with questions rather than quickly moving towards answers. Adults, we rarely stay with questions, and even at school, if a child asks too many questions, again, they're told to shut up, or they're given Ritalin and told they have ADHD. But questions are the lifeblood. How do we encourage more questions and staying with questions rather than easy answers? The poet Rilke talks about learning to love the questions themselves, and allowing the possibility that we can repeat the same questions throughout our lives, and yet because we've changed, the answers will be different. So how do we encourage that? One of the exercises I do is to get executives to write down everything they know about a complex challenge, to fold it up write it on a piece of paper, fold it up and put it into their pocket. I give them another piece of paper and I ask them to write about all the questions they have and curiosities they have about the same challenge, to fold it up and also put it into their pocket. Then to take out both pieces of paper, one in their right hand and one in their left hand, and to just observe which feels the heavier, which feels the lighter, which list was the longer, their knowledge or their curiosity. And the reason I do that is I don't say we're the tabula rasa. We have to hold our knowledge. Our knowledge is valuable, but we have to hold it lightly. And we also have to make space equally for our curiosity, for our questions, for what we don't know. So as a coach, you can reflect also on your identity. Who are you being with your client? What are the presuppositions that you have about yourself, and being present with that? So the invitation here is, how could you experience being a beginner again in your coaching? How might you apply this to your coaching practice? So I'd like to just take a minute. Please enter into the chat. How do you experience being a beginner again in your coaching? How might you apply that to your coaching practice? So enter into your thoughts in the chat. How might you do that? And Joe, if you could read out a few comments, that'd be appreciated.
Yes. Just waiting for them to come through. Okay. Staying present with what the client is saying before rushing to help. Active, reflective listening by being curious. Empathize. Keep them coming in. Sharing instead of teaching. Observing and listening my client and myself. Improvisation. Any more? Keep them coming in. Asking instead of telling. Asking questions to learn. Offering more questions. Open attitude about them, including awakening the body response of the client. Playing with ideas, see what will come up. Working collaboratively. Observing how other beginners learn. We have a nice saying in the coaching training, I don't know you, but I might help you to let you know yourself.
Oh, it's a beautiful, beautiful example. All of them very powerful ways just to engage with what's happening, particularly the improv, rather than what we think is happening. So just key one, and hopefully it's useful to keep that in mind. The second principle, a negative capability, was this idea from the artist Paul Gauguin. He said, close your eyes in order to see. This is a portrait. It's a picture that was award-winning, and the name is Empathy, and you can see why. But what's interesting is that the artist is blind, and he took the poem, the picture, using his hands to make aperture and to sense the environment around him. So the second, close your eyes in order to see, is how often we're over-reliant on one sense or one piece of information or certain individuals in the unknown. There's a saying one of my friends, he says, is this: the eyes are the fascists of the head. And it's true. We tend to talk to the same people. We tend to read the same media. We tend to go to the same sources. So close your eyes in order to see is, how do you widen the aperture? How do you make yourself available to more information in the unknown that may be able to assist your client or to assist yourself? And it was in one of the answers, in many of your answers actually, the power of listening and listening deeply in order to learn. There's a study at the University of Rochester, the medical school, and it said the study showed that doctors interrupt their patients after roughly 23 seconds. And if they only waited another 6 seconds, the patient would share something significant that may have changed the diagnosis. So the issue here is, as we're coaching, how can we encourage not to diagnose or not to propose even a solution, but to wait a bit longer, just those 6 seconds, to allow something new to emerge. So it's something clever, but it's something also, how do we close off the familiar ways, and how do we allow new ways of seeing to emerge? How might we listen more deeply, welcome our feelings as guests? The room is guest house. How might we apply this to our coaching? So I invite you to think about, when you're coaching and when clients are looking at their situation, how might you encourage them to access more possibility, more ways of knowing than their traditional ways? And often working with the body is a powerful one. I've often, when I'm coaching, I've done body work, for example, constellation work with the client in a room. I ask them to stand in a situation or in a decision and notice what's happening in their body, to their breath, somatically, maybe to stand in another position, new possible sources of data than just cognitive or the familiar paths. So there's many ways. I'm sure that many of you have interesting and curious ways to take clients beyond the habitual. And how often do we, as coaches, operate beyond the habitual? Do we always use the same methodology, for example, which we've been trained in? Or are we able to go beyond those particular ways of seeing and be more versatile ourselves as coaches? It's an important question, and it's related again to that freshness of the beginner. The third principle is leap into the dark. And this is a famous photograph many of you are familiar with, by the photographer Yves Klein. And this is one where he's actually in the photograph, and you can see him falling into a Parisian street. But he doesn't look too worried. He's actually got a light smile on his face. And why is he smiling? He's smiling because he was actually a martial artist. He was very embodied, and he knew how to fall safely. But this is also a metaphor for how do we move into the unknown. And one is to take action, but to take a step, or what Kierkegaard called the leap of faith. But we don't have to do that in a dramatic way. So, for example, one of the things I've been scared of since child is great heights, suffering from vertigo. And I decided to experiment with this. And one of the things I decided to do was to try to do a trapeze, a high trapeze jump. So in London, in Regent's Park, there's a trapeze, flying trapeze in the summer. So I went along. I think I was the only one who was above 10 years old, and lots of children who were excited, and I was quite anxious and scared. But what we did was we practiced on a very low ground. So we practiced safely with harnesses, getting more confidence. But then the time came to climb this pole. I think it was like 40 feet high in the air. And the trapeze was such that at the top was a small wooden board, you stood on it, and you had to lean forward. And there was a point when you're leaning that you had to let go of the pole on the top. Otherwise, you'd be torn apart. So you had to go with it. And at the very top, you could let go and hook the legs over, and you could fall backwards. And that's exactly what I did. And what I learned from this was this idea that, when we're experimenting with leaping, we don't just fall into the unknown, or we don't just have to leap in a big leap. We can practice with safety. We can practice with small experiments before we do the large leaps. But there comes a time that we have to let go. And there comes a time we have to do that because we'll be torn apart. I think there's another Hopi poem about the river. And it says, if you don't flow into the center of the river, then you'll experience that pain. But the interesting thing as well is that the greatest movement, the greatest possibility of transformation happens not on the ground, but in the air where you're least stable. Think about it like the ballerina or the gymnast. They're not their most moving on the ground, but in the air, that's when the possibility arises. I remember when I was going through a difficult time at work. It was a number of years ago, and there was some redundancies and lots of changes. And my mentor said to me, I said, I'm worried I won't, what's going to happen. He said, Stephen, this time of instability is the time of greatest possibility. When things are fixed, there's no possibility. But when things are groundless, when you're not stable, then you have the most potential for movement. So I'd like you to think about what are the different ways you can experiment. A nice case study is from the company in Intuit, which own the tax software Quicken. And they wanted to solve the problem of helping rural farmers raise the prices of their crops. And they experimented with giving them phones, but many were illiterate. They had to find a way to signal the prices in the market. But they didn't come up with one solution. They came up with multiple experiments, and they tried each experiment to see what would work. So when we're working with coaches, we may not have a solution, but we might be thinking about what are multiple experiments, and maybe the client can generate these experiments to try. And they don't have to be big. One of the lovely phrases I like is a phrase called Trojan mice. How can you release small experiments rather than big Trojan horses? Small experiments are easy to do. There's less resistance because they're so small, but they can give you valuable data, and they can be just as effective. And when you're doing a leap of faith, how might you benefit from support? How might you practice and give support in the experiment? And the last capability was delight in the unknown. It can feel painful, but also it's a potential moment of joy. And it's a time actually that we're called on to give empathy and compassion, particularly. I remember speaking with a Zen master, and she said, Stephen, when you're going through the unknown, that's not the time to give up cigarettes and alcohol. That's time to be kind and compassionate to yourself, less beating ourselves up, and more acceptance also for others. I'm going to show you a short video here. It's from the Cleveland Hospital. It's called Empathy, and it just shows how can we put ourselves in other people's shoes and also into their thinking when they're facing, rather than when we're in crisis, we tend to become more self-obsessed and lose our ability to think about others. So it's a very powerful video, and if you want to look it up, it's available on YouTube. It says Cleveland Hospital Empathy Video. And it really challenges us to think about how can we show more support to ourselves and our clients when they're going through the unknown, and what's your own self-care routine, but how might you help your client to do the same, similar to the reactions at the edge. So I'd like to finish the talk to you today with a story from the myths, the Greek myths, which often tell us timeless truths that can be helpful for today. And there's the myth of Eros and Psyche that many of you will be familiar with. And Psyche was separated from Eros and given several tasks by the goddess Aphrodite. And if she completed them, she would be reunited. And she managed to complete them with the help of nature and with the help of the other gods. And the last task was to get the perfume box of the goddess Persephone, who was the goddess of the underworld. And why that was the impossible task was because nobody went to the underworld and returned. But she managed to get the penny to pay the ferryman to cross the river Styx. She managed to go past the ravenous dogs. She managed to descend, and she met Persephone, who was renowned for her beauty. And she got the perfume box, and Persephone gave her one condition. Said, you can have the box, but do not open the box. So Psyche had the box. She would be reunited with her lover. And as she was ascending, what do you think she did? She opened the box. And the myth says she fell asleep, which is a euphemism for she died. What was in the box? It'll be interesting to know your guesses. So what was in the box if you're familiar with the myth? But what scholars think was in the box was knowledge of mortality. And the reason why Persephone was so beautiful is she didn't know death. And the one thing that the gods envied was that they were not able to not know. They were omniscient. So the gift of not knowing allows something special, even though it's a painful to bear. It allows us to live every day with freshness, wonder, curiosity, to start every day with a new beginning. And this is not something that it's something to be really valued and to be really held dearly. So I'd like you to reflect and put into the chat, what have you learned in this session today about your relationship to not knowing? And maybe one action you could take, or one question that you could live with to enhance your coaching practice. So maybe it's not action, but it's some question that you're living with that might enhance your coaching practice as a result of not knowing. So I invite you to enter that into the chat. I'd like to finish just with encouraging you, just to summarize. It's important just to be aware of your reactions at the edge. Practice saying, I don't know, particularly in safe situations. Think about experiments that you can try and encourage your client to try. And the last, how to show compassion to yourself and to others going through the unknown. And I'll leave with my favorite quote. It's from the Spanish poet, Chilean Spanish poet, Antonio Machado. He says, traveler, there is no path. The path is made by walking. And for the Spanish speakers, I know there's someone from Bogota, Colombia. It sounds much more beautiful in Spanish. But the encouragement here is we're not walking that path alone. We're walking that path in community. And I'd like to thank you for participating or listening to this talk. You can find me on Amazon for the book, Not Knowing. And there's also the follow-up, Not Doing. You can see the trend here, and I'm writing Not Being at the moment. And you can also find my TEDx talk, Stephen dsouza, TEDx Clapham. And it's called Not Knowing, where you can have a recap of some of the principles and the ideas in this talk. So thank you very much for inviting me, Jo, and I'll hand over to you.
That's lovely. Somebody's asking, could you repeat the name of the artist of the empathy picture, please?
It's Cleveland Hospital in the US.
The picture of...
the picture is Eve Klein.
That's it. Thank you very much. Okay, so I'll come back to you, Stephen. I just have a few announcements to make. Thank you, everyone, for your attention.